Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us. We are letting folks in right now, and we're going to get started in about 2 minutes. But just as a friendly reminder, as always, please mute yourself so that we don't have any sort of, unintended noises while the presentation conversation is happening. We very much encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourself. We love to know your name, the pronouns that you use, where you're calling or zooming in from today, and how you fit into the arts and cultural community. We have two amazing speakers with us today who are gonna we'll do a little bit more of a formal information sharing, but we are holding time for questions, right? Because this can feel overwhelming or confusing, and so we want to make sure that you get your questions answered. So with that said, I'm going to get us rolling. Welcome to Advocacy 301, Do's and Don'ts for Nonprofits. I'm really delighted. I'm Emily Reddick. I'm not delighted about being Emily Reddick. I'm Emily Reddick. I'm Executive Director of Mass Creative, and I'm really delighted to that we are doing this webinar in partnership with the Mass Nonprofit Network and Jessica Seney, as well as the Arts and Business Council and Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, represented by Luke Blackadar. And so for those of you who are not familiar, the Arts and Business Council and the Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts is in the business of supporting artists and organizations with the tools and services they need to grow their practice, gain influence, seek justice, and thrive. They have, through the Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts program, can match individuals and organizations with lawyers who are working on pro bono time to support your work. They also have a number of other programs, including Business on Board and Creative Campus and fellowships. So check them out if you haven't already. Mass Nonprofit Network, which I will say I am a very proud board member of, is in the business of supporting our broader nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector in Massachusetts is strong and is responsible for both providing direct services to many across the Commonwealth, making communities more vibrant through both direct services and then through art and culture. And we are really lucky to have the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network there as a staunch ally with us in terms of advocacy, as well as helping to navigate through really challenging times. So Jessica, thank you so much for being here. And Luke, thank you so much for being here. So we are going to so why are we holding this? We are holding this because I would say, particularly within the arts and cultural sector, we've all done a little bit of study and history. We know that time and time again, the arts community has been sort of pushed to not advocate, right? And scared out of not lobbying or directly advocating for the things that they need. Everything from the culture wars that started in the 80s all the way through this moment. So we want to make sure that cultural and arts nonprofits have the information they need to get off the bench and to advocate and to support their communities around the top priority issues that both affect your organizations and your communities. And we want to make sure that you feel confident that you have the knowledge about how to do that in a way that is going to make most sense for your organization and isn't going to endanger your tax exempt status. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Luke, who's going to give us just a quick rundown of advocacy, lobbying, and nonprofits. So Luke, I'm going to pin your little square, your Brady Bunch square, and take it away.
Cool. Yes, and I have a couple slides just to help illustrate some of these points. So where do we start? All of this, guidance and regulation around political activity and lobbying and advocacy stems from Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, a section that is very near and dear to all of our hearts, even if whether you're a tax lawyer or not. And the language here is specifically what you see on screen. So basically, corporations are eligible for tax exempt status as long as no substantial part of the activities is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, and also no competition or no participation in political campaigns. for or in opposition for any candidate for public office. So this is the language. So there's really two big kind of areas where we're starting to regulate. One, influencing legislation, namely lobbying, and then two, political campaign activity and participation, supporting opposing candidates for public office. So that's where the regulations start, and that is where a lot of our guidance flows from. So in other words, no political campaign activity is permitted, and then lobbying, as we understand it, is allowed in some limited quantities. Um, so the things that you can do are, again, things like lobbying, as long as you're doing it in, fairly modest amounts. So this is kind of, traditional lobbying, namely persuading legislators, elected officials to participate or to support or oppose pending legislation or to sponsor pending legislation. Here's a bill that helps our cause, helps our mission, or, supports something that we believe in, you really should vote for this in favor of passing this bill. That's kind of very traditional lobbying. And then also influencing voters and persuading voters to support or oppose pending legislation. That is kind of what we refer to as grassroots lobbying. Um, and again, as you saw, the Internal Revenue Code allows some lobbying by exempt public charities, but it can't amount to a substantial part of the charity's activities. What is substantial? I don't know. It's a couple of, varying standards on it. It really depends on the specific facts and circumstances of the lobbying activity. And it also depends in part on, what is the relation of the lobbying activity and your exempt function, your exempt purpose. You tend to have a little bit more breadth if the political lobbying really is central to your charitable purpose. Um, but generally, the facts and circumstances include things like staff time, volunteer time, expenditures, etc. Like how much of your resources are you dedicating towards your lobbying activity? And the IRS is very, very reluctant to enforce any specific percentage. So they're never going to give you a, thumbs up or thumbs down or a bright line rule as to what amount of time or what amount of money is the right amount, except if you make what's called a Section 501H election, where basically now you're opting to have your lobbying activity measured by a specific expenditure, which is basically a proportion of your total expenses. Here's a chart. We don't have to go through it. This is just kind of how the IRS thinks about it and how they weigh your lobbying expenditure tests. Again, it's a factor of your total exempt purpose expenditure. So how much you're spending on, staff, resources, rents and office supplies and things like that. How much of your exempt function expenditures are being spent on lobbying, and it's certain percentages that are allowable. So that's kind of true lobbying. We're trying to persuade either elected officials and legislators specifically, or voting populations to oppose or support pending legislation. What about political education? What if we are trying to just provide information and try to communicate, this is what is happening. This is what, the contents of this bill or this legislation says, or this is what this elected official has voted to support or oppose in the past. What if we're simply acting as a vehicle to communicate information and bring information about this kind of political activity to the public? Same deal. Again, it varies. I like having fun with my PowerPoints, okay? But so educating the public about a political candidate might not be political campaign activity. It might not fall into that bucket of, restricted campaign activity if you're presenting the information fairly neutrally. Educating the public about pending legislation might not be lobbying. Again, it depends on, is your goal to persuade? If you're presenting information and you're simply communicating facts and data, etc., in a nonpartisan, non-editorial, and non-persuasive manner, then this might fall within kind of neither of those. It might not fall within lobbying. It might not fall within political campaign activity. This is now just kind of what we think of as advocacy, presenting information, presenting facts, and simply conveying the data to the voting and decision-making public. Um, so those are kind of the things that you are allowed to do. And again, the key with this really is um, editorialization and commentary and persuasiveness. If you are intending, if you're conveying information with a pretty clear goal and it's very obvious to the person who's reviewing or receiving the information that you're trying to persuade them to, make a decision or lean one way or the other, then now we're starting to get into regulated territory. But if you are simply saying, this is what this statute or what this pending legislation says, this is what it contains, and this is what, even what the effects of it are, as long as, again, you're presenting it fairly neutrally, then that's typically okay. Same as, here we're publishing the record of, this legislator's voting history and the bills that they've sponsored. We're simply, showing this is how they've, voted on various arts and culture, et cetera, initiatives. That is okay as long as your goal is not to persuade. Once you get to persuasion, now we're in regulated territory. Um, so I think that's kind of the basics of it. Um, so I'll turn it back to you, Emily, if you want to kind of give more color to it. You're muted, Emily.
One would think I understood that at this point. Excuse me. So thanks, Luke, for that quick overview. I dropped into the chat a really helpful handout from Boulder Advocacy, which is an excellent organization that really is in the business of encouraging nonprofits to engage in advocacy more boldly, hence their name. And one of the things is Luke is a registered lawyer, and so he's not going to say it. So I will say this. You will never find the IRS give an exact amount of how much lobbying you can do. Most tax preparers and most auditors are going to tell you it's between 3 and 5% of your overall sort of work together. For context, Mass Creative staff has to log every hour that we spend on the various things that we do. And we log maybe 15% of our time for direct lobbying, right? And so if you think about the business that Mass Creative is in, only 15% of our time is dedicated to lobbying. And as Luke pointed out, lobbying is a direct ask to say, yes, sponsor this bill, or no, or to engage your advocates or your community to say, tell your lawmaker to support this bill or not. So I want to turn it over to Jessica. Jessica, so that was like a lot of information. Can you help us sort of contextualize or make some meaning around that in terms of like, how does this actually like show up within a nonprofit?
Absolutely. And Emily, I'd also just like to note that in Massachusetts, we also do have specific laws relating to lobbying activity, which if your organization, and I'm sorry, I don't have the number in front of me right now, but I think if an employee is working on lobbying activities for more than 15 hours a year, you do need to register with the Secretary of State as a registered lobbyist. So not only does the IRS have laws and regulations around lobbying activity, but our state does as well. And it does encourage and allow nonprofits to engage in advocacy and lobbying. But once you reach a certain threshold, you do just need to follow state law. So I just want to make that acknowledgement now, and can certainly follow up with more information on what the exact thresholds or boundaries are for that as well. And thank you, Emily, for having me, and thank you all for attending. My gosh, advocacy is always an important, but right now with the climate that we're in, even more so. So I'd also like to say, just right off of the bat, to the extent that you yourself can encourage your networks to vote at every election, municipal, statewide, and of course, federal, it's incredibly important because for better or worse, elected officials tend to pay more attention to those people in those communities who are engaged in our democracy. And while, of course, people cannot access records as to whom you've voted for, they can see the number of times you have voted and the number of times you show up to the ballot. Or to cast a ballot. So please engage and encourage others to get out and vote. So, what can you do as an organization? Well, it's incredibly important that you introduce yourself to policymakers, whether it be your state representative or your state senator, and then certainly your congressional delegation as well. So find out who represents you, both where you live and also where your place of business is located. And send an email, ask for a meeting, find out if they have office hours to introduce yourself and the work that you're doing, to share the importance of how your work contributes to our communities and to their constituents. Legislators will be interested and engaged to hear about what you're doing, particularly to make our communities better. So just at a start, that's just having a meeting and that's just sharing information about what you do. That certainly is not lobbying. And I wouldn't even say that goes as far as advocating. You're just sharing and you're educating them about your work. Now, there are a number of ways in which you could maybe transfer that to lobbying or direct advocacy. For example, the state gives out a number of grants each year through the budget or other economic development vehicles where you might qualify for an earmark. So you can always talk to your legislator about the importance of work that you're doing and to ask for state funding, for example. Right now, we're in a tricky budget situation, especially with what's happening on the federal level and cuts coming, most likely to the state at some point in time, that there might not be as many opportunities for earmarks or direct money from the state. But going forward, that's always something to keep in mind, that you can say, look, here's why my work is important and here's why state government should help fund us. Additionally, there are and have been bills that impact your sector. We at MNN tend to look at the sector as a whole and operational laws or regulations that impact nonprofits' ability to be successful. So I can give you some examples about that, but one that comes to mind is, the theater tax credit that wasn't on the books. And then at some point, an organization, maybe Mass Creative, I don't know, I'm sorry if you were heavily involved in advocating for that, but of course, then the law changed. There's a tax credit for live theater productions, and that helps support your economy and the people who work in the sector. So at MNN, we have worked very hard on a number of broad issues that impact the sector overall. And we've sent notifications to our members as well, encouraging advocacy and for individuals to reach out on the issues that will impact them as well. And I will say, even though we may be leading the charge on some of these issues, strength in numbers really matter. So, for example, we recently sent letters to the state Senate on an issue that I'll share more about, but we joined a coalition with Mass Creative and several other statewide associations of nonprofits to elevate our voices together to say it's not just one organization that has an issue, but collectively we identify this proposal as being negatively impactful to the sector. So we're all signing this together. And you can find similar organizations to your own that may, have a similar interest in a bill or a similar interest in opposing a bill and come together to elevate your voices as well. Doesn't have to be just one individual. So I'll just quickly share. Every year, the governor submits a budget proposal about state spending. Then the House and the Senate each do their own versions of their budgets. And while the budgets are primarily spending bills, there are often policy sections that are included that could impact a law having to do with anything in the state. So when Governor Healy filed the administration's budget proposal in January, one idea that she included was to cap the income tax deduction that is currently allowed for charitable contributions. So right now, any individual can give to a charity and they receive a state income tax break for that donation. The proposal was to cap the deduction to 5% for individuals and 10% of the deduction or of the charitable contributions for married filing jointly couples. So we saw this in the proposal. We did our own background research to understand how this would impact nonprofits if all of a sudden those giving donations had a cap on how much they could receive an income tax deduction. We started letting other people in our membership know that this proposal was there and inviting feedback so that we could have a sense of how wide this proposal would impact nonprofits in the Commonwealth. And then we decided that from what we had heard and how negative of an impact this budget proposal could be, we decided it was time to advocate and to reach out on behalf of the sector. So we started by having meetings with high-level officials, first in the House of Representatives, to let them know how capping the charitable deduction could actually reduce donations to charities. And especially in light of what's happening right now with federal funds being clawed back or taken away, frozen, now is not the time for the state to do anything that could limit donations to nonprofits in Massachusetts. So we've had meetings, we have sent letters. As I mentioned, we sent a coalition letter. We've encouraged our members to reach out to their legislators to let them know the negative impacts that this budget proposal would have on their organization. And thankfully, just this week, the House released their budget and they did not include the governor's proposed cap. So while that's a small win because it's just the first step in the ultimate budget process, we felt like we really communicated an unintended consequence of the cap, and the House was receptive. So now the Senate will be writing their budget. We will continue to have meetings with Senate leaders and staff, and we'll continue to send letters and encourage people who will also be impacted and organizations that would be impacted to speak up as well. So that is one concrete example of how we identified an issue that would impact organizations across the Commonwealth, and we weighed in and advocated on behalf of the sector.
Jessica, that's so helpful. So can you just like working through that, like where, because I think like this is the thing, is like what was the lobbying actions and what were the advocacy actions? Because I want to reiterate for everybody on this call, you can do as much advocacy as you want if you're a nonprofit that's under a 501c3. It's the lobbying that there's a limit to. So would you mind just walking us through that, Jessica?
Sure. So lobbying specifically, I think would be the sentence in our letter and the conversations that we had where we said, please do not include the proposed cap. Very clearly, do not make any change to current law. Do not include this proposal. We are trying to influence policymakers' decisions about what to do pertaining to current law. If we were to simply have a meeting and say, we just want to inform you and to educate you about potentially an unintended consequence or a consequence of this law changing, such that if there's no longer an incentive for individuals to give high amounts to charities, then perhaps these charities will not receive as much funding and won't be able to provide as many services or may need to lay off individuals if they don't have the same budget capacity. So informing legislators about the impacts of the bill without taking a position on the proposal is advocacy. And letting them know, just simply educating them about the work that you're doing and why your work is so important and why you need continued funding to be able to give back to the community is simply just sharing, educating about the importance of your work. And certainly, I would say does not cross into the level of lobbying. So I hope that's helpful.
That's so helpful. Thank you. Another sort of piece that you mentioned is when you went to the field and you said this, you know, the governor's budget includes a cap on this. This is what it means. Now that would be public education, right? You weren't saying like, this is what it means and call up your lawmaker and tell them right now not to do it, right? That would be the grassroots lobbying, correct?
Exactly. And I would say too, you know, so many organizations, I guess, whether you're a small for-profit business or a nonprofit, I am a registered lobbyist. That is my role at M&N. But of course, so many organizations don't have the capacity to have somebody on staff to be following legislation and what's happening. So it is incredibly important that we share proposed changes so that, you know, our networks and others who don't have in-house capacity are aware of what's going on. And then so we did both in our communications. We not only let people know what the proposed change was and how it could potentially impact them. But we also did include a call to action, which then, again, ventures into the lobbying. And we are a 501(c)(3), so our lobbying activities are not, as far as I understand, a substantial component of our work and why we can continue to do what we are doing. But yes, we did engage our membership to contact their legislators or to reach out to me for further questions so that I could kind of guide others who don't have experience in terms of how to um, advocate on behalf of their organization.
Thanks, Jessica. And just another plug. So Mass Nonprofit Network is taking care of the broader nonprofit sector. They are strong partners with Mass Creative. We work hand in glove a lot of the times when we're thinking about how the nonprofit portion of the creative sector is going to be impacted. And that's why organizations like Mass Nonprofit Network and Mass Creative are so valuable, right? Because we have staff on our team who are regularly paying attention, tracking this, and being able to share out that information. So thank you, Jessica, for doing that. Because that was one of those issues that Mass Creative did not have the bandwidth to follow so closely, but because we worked together, we were able to share out that information. Okay, I'm gonna switch us. So we've talked a lot about like legislation and budget asks, right? Now we're gonna go back to Luke, and Luke's gonna help us understand, because there's another piece, right, which he's already talked a little bit about, which is elections, right? So will you talk us through both elections, and I hope I'm not throwing a frisbee at you here, but like both in terms of candidates and ballot questions when we're talking about advocating and engaging in those?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the political candidate side, the rule is pretty absolute. It is, absolutely 100% prohibition on any political campaign activity. If you are a 501(c)(3), if you're an exempt nonprofit, you cannot support or oppose any candidate for public office. No exceptions. And if you violate this, that is a, fast track to getting your tax exempt status revoked. And that's something that the IRS takes very seriously. So, at least for federal law purposes, when we talk about politicians and kind of the people who are really we're focusing on with this, it is candidates for public office. So if it is a political candidate who is an incumbent who is not eligible to be a candidate for public office, they're not running for an election, it is not legally federal, it's not federal lobbying under the US tax code if you are, expressing support for those people, if they're not a candidate for public office, or, it's not an independently, or it's not an elected position. So it's a little bit more nuanced in that regard, but at least with respect to elections, when we're talking about the actual human political candidates, no support or opposition. There are some kind of gray areas, though. Not really gray areas, but there are some things that you can do that might feel like we're leaning towards political campaign support, but actually we're not. I think a couple of good examples are, organizations that put out questionnaires for all political candidates to answer. Like, what are your, positions on this, that, the other, or how would you vote on this, that, the other? As long as we're sharing it to all candidates, all candidates for the role, and we're sharing it in a way that's simply matter of fact, this is what they respond. That's okay. And again, like I said earlier, sharing an incumbent's voting history on a mission-related issue, that's okay. This is how this person has voted on, these issues in the past. That's okay. That is, again, more advocacy. We're communicating information. Similarly, in hosting forums or fora or kind of town hall meetings where you have candidates coming together and you're asking them questions and you're giving them all an equal opportunity to share positions, share values, share things like that. In a, again, neutral, non-editorial, kind of critical way, or critical in the sense of, I'm not particularly, showing any favoritism or disfavoritism towards any particular person who's attending, any particular candidate. Again, the key is neutrality, and again, acting as a vehicle to convey information. One area where this can get a little bit trickier and where some, nonprofits have, lost their exempt status and got dinged pretty hard, is this you see in the right column, ranking or certifying candidates are doing this kind of like seal of approval for candidates that, say things that are, align with our values, based on, kind of a combination of political campaign support and kind of this more sharing information of, oh, this is how, this candidate has voted on arts issues and arts and culture needs in the past, 4 years. And based on what they do, we give them, our mass creative seal of approval. They're a champion for the arts type of thing. That is bad. That is leaning away from simply neutrally sharing the information and going more towards political campaign support. Now we're showing our kind of appreciation or affect towards this, affection towards this candidate. And this actually happened with the New York State Bar Association, where, New York has elected judges, and we had the New York State Bar Association was saying, this judge is kind of a NY Bar certified candidate, because, this is how they vote or how they feel on, this, that, the other type of judicial issues. And they lost their exempt status over it. So this is an area where it gets a little bit tricky, because one of the questions we get pretty often is, well, can I invite a candidate to a forum or to a town hall meeting to talk about this, that, the other? You can, but to avoid falling into this trap, you typically want to also make it available to other candidates for office, people who are going to be, competing for the same role. And again, you're presenting the questions and the participation in a way that is not really trying to lead, the attendees and the public who are visiting, make a certain conclusion. You really want to give them the ability to make their own conclusions and not guide them towards a particular outcome. Now, with respect to things like ballot initiatives, that falls more in line with, if anything, grassroots lobbying. If it's, I'm this ballot, or this question is put on the ballot for, voters to vote on, if we're making heads or tails of it, that falls more into this grassroots lobbying, which kind of falls more into the umbrella of lobbying. And again, no substantial amount. That is permissible with some, with limitations. One of the things that can become very tricky in an election year, the alignment with lobbying and political campaign activity, is when a, legislative issue or a policy issue becomes central to a political campaign. If you are, for example, if you are, an immigrants' rights and immigration advocacy organization, an immigration support organization, and suddenly, it's a, election year, and it becomes a very, very hot political issue that is highly debated, and you can identify certain, political parties and political candidates with, particular sides. That's where it gets really, really difficult when you start to get these like white hot policy issues that become really closely identified and kind of become, key defining parts of a campaign. That's where you have to be extremely careful, because now, the line between purely lobbying and purely trying to influence legislation and actually supporting or opposing a political candidate, where those lines get very, very blurry. And again, you kind of see sometimes, organizations try to, show or, they try and circumvent a finding of unauthorized political campaign participation by focusing more on, like, this particular legislative issue that is so closely identified and associated with a particular, it's unambiguously identified with a particular side or a particular political candidate. So that's one of those things that very, very quickly can become a minefield. And it happens, certainly in presidential election years, and certainly in other even midterm election years. This is something that can get really, really tricky. And things like, right now, immigration, it's very, very easy to fall into that trap of, we're simply an organization that, supports this or supports kind of, you know, providing resources and support and assistance for immigrants and things like that. Um, it can very quickly spiral into feels like you're starting to engage in political campaign activity now, because this, candidate A is so closely aligned with, this policy on immigration versus that policy on immigration, et cetera. So that is something to be on the lookout for. And that's something to be very, very careful and very deliberate about if that's part of your goal, part of your mission, part of your objective is to, support these types of legislation. Once it starts to get closely identified with a political candidate, then you have to, proceed with caution and make sure you're doing everything as neutrally and productively as possible. And you're really sticking to the legislation and avoiding, kind of the noise around the political offices surrounding it.
That's really helpful, Luke. Thank you. I want to just also flag here. So far, you've talked about like the organization taking a position saying like, we like this candidate or we don't, which we can't do. But there's a couple of other things, right? Just to reiterate, and you confirm for me, nonprofit organizations cannot make contributions, like actual money contributions to candidates, correct?
No, not at all. You are not permitted to do that. That is another fast track to losing your 501(c)(3) status.
Nonprofit organizations are not allowed to make an in-kind donation to a candidate or to a candidate committee. And that could look like donating your space for a fundraiser, sending out like sharing your email list with the political campaign. Those are not allowed, correct?
No, not one bit. Those are additionally because ultimately it still amounts to political campaign activity and political campaign support. So yes, money contributions, in-kind contributions, even if it feels like it is, innocuous or neutral, in the eyes of the IRS and your regulators, that is providing support to a candidate.
Thanks. Another one would be potentially putting up a candidate sign on the front of your theater building.
Mm-hmm.
Cannot do that. Okay. Can you invite both candidates to tour your facility?
Yeah, that's as long as you are, again, if you are providing a space for both sides, all candidates for the office, and you're doing it fairly equally and not, again, giving any particular one special attention, like, oh, you get priority parking, or you get, you're also invited to attend one of our shows, but, candidate A gets the reserve seat right in the front, and candidate B is in the nosebleeds. Like, you know, again, it is. Does it look like what you're doing is trying to show favoritism for one party versus another? But yeah, if you're inviting all participants, that's okay. If it's, you're bringing everyone together equally and giving them kind of equal space and equal attention, that is permissible.
Um, there's a really great question in the chat, which we'll get to in just a moment. Thank you, Carrie. That's a very good specific example. Before we do that though, Jessica, can you give like, again, a little bit more color commentary about like sort of what does this look like in application? I sort of already did a little bit of that, but it would be great to hear from you as well.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. So, I would just reiterate too that you can certainly go and inform candidates about what your work is and why it's important to the community, because that will also give them a lens through which they'll view potential voters and, can indirectly, I don't want to say sway, but can, inform them of what's important to community and to voters so that maybe they pay more attention to certain issues if they are elected or they realize that issues are important to the community. So, again, you cannot choose to highlight one specific candidate in terms of their responses to be supportive of you, but you can encourage them to be aware of the work that you are doing and to educate them. And additionally, nonprofits really are trusted community partners. We provide services and engagement with voters. And so to the extent that we can be a resource to the voting community to help them understand where, elections are being held, the times that elections are being held. If they have questions about how you actually engage in voting, what a ballot looks like, you can share sample ballots. You can, provide the phone numbers for the election offices if voters have questions. You can even engage in voter registration, and I think Mass Creative has done that. And that's really huge to get people on the voting rolls. If you have people in your community that are not registered to vote, nonprofits can engage with them and get people to become engaged themselves and to actively vote, which is huge. There's actually a nonprofit vote study that shows that when nonprofits do engage with their communities, the community turns out to vote 10 percentage points more than communities where nonprofits haven't engaged. So again, you don't want to be saying, please go vote for so-and-so, but you do want to encourage your constituents, your networks to engage in voting. And that can really provide higher turnout.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then sorry, you covered so much about the practical applications too, about hosting candidate forums or providing questionnaires where you share answers so long as you don't rank preferences based on their answers. And then I would just say too, nonprofits, and Luke did touch on this in terms of whether it's lobbying, but you can support or oppose ballot measures. So if there is something that is of great importance to your community, you can take a position on that and share your position with your communities and try to affect a different outcome based on how it will affect you. So just wanted to be clear about that as well.
So thanks, Jessica. And I'm going to just bring up two examples from Mass Creative's own life, we're an organization, not a person, but there was a ballot question that was about affirming trans people's rights in Massachusetts. Question 3, I believe, was the name of it. And Mass Creative actually came out and endorsed and said that we should protect the rights of trans people in Massachusetts. And the reason that we did it was, there are trans people who work at our cultural organizations and are trans artists that deserve to be able to have the same rights that we all have. And that we have audiences and community that we are serving that include trans people, and they should be able to access and have access to facilities and amenities and have rights just like any other person. And so we not only signed on to that campaign to say we are in support of this ballot message, but we also shared the reason why we were doing that with our larger constituency, right? And so that was a ballot question, and we were totally allowed to do that. I also want to just remind folks that a program that Mass Creative has done since 2013, Create the Vote, is a 100% nonpartisan campaign. So what that means is the campaign activities that we do, we connect with candidates and make sure that they are hearing directly from members of the arts community in the district with which they're running, so they can hear directly about the impact and what are the challenges that the sector is facing. We share out information about what is at stake during an election and make sure that we are mobilizing people to vote and to pay attention to who is running and to do their own research around what those candidates are talking about. We share out a questionnaire that every candidate who's running for a specific office receives, and we publish those candidate questionnaires. As Luke said, we don't editorialize them, we don't summarize them, we don't put gold stars next to one candidate's questionnaire and not the others. We literally just post the information side by side for folks to understand. We host candidate forums where members of the community can hear directly from candidates on what their vision and their potential policy platform is around arts and culture. We don't editorialize that. We don't say good job to one candidate, you messed it up in this other candidate. We don't give one candidate more time to talk than another candidate, right? That is an entirely nonpartisan voting candidate engagement process, right? And so if you're a nonprofit and you want to work on a Create the Vote campaign, you can do so safely knowing that you are not in any way engaging in electioneering with that work. Okay, so we've got some questions from folks. Oh, Jessica, yeah, you got
I'm just going to add in one more thing as I'm going over my notes. One other thing you can do is to host a phone or a text bank during election time to encourage people to go and vote. So again, not to vote for a specific candidate, but hey, the election's tomorrow. Please go and vote. Just as a reminder and encouragement, it can really uh, have a greater turnout, result in greater turnout.
Thanks, Jessica. That's another thing in 2020, right? I think many of you on this call participated in this effort. We understood that the elections of 2020 were one thing, but actually helping people understand and navigate the voting process was entirely another. And so as members of the creative community, we organized a Create the Vote campaign that was solely an information about how to vote, how to register, how to get your mail-in ballot, how to vote early, how to participate in the census that year, right? And we did that because we felt it was really important as the creative sector to play our part in making sure that people turned out to vote and participated in the census, right? So that is exactly, we are 100% within our rights to do that as a community and as 501c3s. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions in the chat that I'm hoping Luke and Jessica, you won't mind answering. So the first one is, could you invite an elected official, a currently elected official, to join a concert program to showcase their particular artist skills, their musical skills or their artistic skills?
I mean, if it's solely for the purpose of exhibiting their artistic skill, and if you're compensating them, even as like, and this gets to the other question about, transactional relationship where someone's, paying for goods and services for like, fair compensation. I think that would probably be okay, but the one currently elected, the example here was, mayor who is currently up for reelection. So it's like, if it's an incumbent, they're an elected official, but they're currently in office and they're not running again or anything like that, there's no possibility that they're going to campaign again or they're not campaigning at all. Sure, yeah, fine. They're not running for office. It's not an issue. If they are running for office, even though they're incumbent, and the minute they take their bow and they get up and they say, "Okay, vote," as soon as you hear the vote, cut the mic, yank them off stage, close the curtains, show's over, everyone, because now you're starting to get into political campaign activity. But no, I mean, to the extent that they are providing, ordinary goods and services and things like that that are relative to the organization. That's okay. But again, now we're starting to get into that, almost analogous with like, think of conflicts of interest with your own boards and stuff like that. Like in these kind of insider transactions, it's the same kind of dynamic. As long as you have that arm's length and it's solely for the purpose of this narrow reason. But again, you also think of what are the ordinary members of the public, the voting public, going to think? What will the IRS think? Are they going to look at that and see, why do you invite this person who happens to be, a politician, an elected official who might be running for reelection? Oh, isn't it so convenient? So you do have to, again, it's a minefield because it is kind of a gray area. And on the one hand, I think there's a justification. I think it's also very easy that it could be a torpedo in the water.
So if, for example, you had invited the mayor to perform the piano starting in her first year after she was sworn in, before she had announced she was running for office, and that became an annual invitation, that is a different relationship and conversation than if in the year in which they have announced they are running for reelection, you just so happen to invite them. That's the optics of this are going to look different, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And that's the other thing I just want to like flag for both Luke and Jessica to like underline. Sorry about that. Is that right? Like there's what the law says, right? What the IRS regulations and what the Massachusetts, it's all managed under the Secretary of State says we have to do and can't do. But then there's the optics, right? And so that's the other piece, right? Like you can be following, as Luke sort of pointed out, you can be following the letter of the law, but how that's interpreted to your audiences and your community is another thing. And that's something that like neither Luke and Jessica nor I can sort of give you a definitive answer on. You're going to have to, your communities better. Is that helpful? Would you say, Luke and Jessica? Okay, great. Okay, so there's another question. Can a transactional relationship exist between candidates and your organization? So, for example, they buy tickets for your event or they rent your space. Can they do that and without you falling into the category of electioneering as in 501(c)(3)?
I think it depends on what they're using it for. If it's we're buying tickets to attend an event, attend your concert, attend, your show, we're buying art from you. I think that's one thing. I think again, kind of to the earlier point, that is they're engaging in your routine services, your routine activity, and they're just participating kind of as an ordinary patron. Sure. I think where it gets tricky again, why are they renting, why are they renting space from you? Is it for a campaign fundraiser? Uh-oh. Or is it for some other non-campaign, election related activity, that might be okay. Um, I think for that, I think it's going to depend on more on the use and the purpose. I think, the specific example of like, they're renting a space from you. If it's, for Campaign HQ, that gets more to, are you're still giving services? Are you still giving some type of benefit to a political campaign, even if it is for compensation?
And just to like do a little finer point on it, if they did say we want to hold like a campaign rally, we're going to rent your hall for a campaign rally, you could legally rent it to them. You could not make any sort of a discount to them. They would have to follow whatever the rental rates are that you have posted or that you provide to anyone else. The
Yeah.
optics are a different story, right? So if they rent the hall, the optics may look like a implicit endorsement without you even trying making one. But legally, as long as you make them pay what everybody else would have to pay, you can do that, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And you make sure you're putting 1,000 asterisks around it. Like, also, we don't take any position on this candidate's campaign. Like, we're, you know, cross your T's, dot your I's.
Okay. Awesome. Is there anything we should keep in mind when inviting elected officials to events rather than candidates?
If they're an elected official and they are not a candidate, like they're already in office, they're an incumbent, and we don't have a campaign on the horizon. No, that's okay. It's once they're in office and it's no longer an election, then you can engage with them again. And now you just have, now you're back to, is what I'm doing amounting to something like lobbying, and I'm very glad that, Jess and Emily mentioned that, like, part of this that is okay is educating your elected officials too and educating your candidates. It's not political campaign activity. It is not unpermitted lobbying for you to educate your elected officials and your candidates about what you do. It's okay when the information is flowing from you to them. It's more, are they trying to persuade you? Are they trying to get you to support them, et cetera? That's when you have to cut it off. But an essential part of this is letting them know what you're doing as well. But no, if they're already in office, they already are in their position, and now they're working for you. Yeah, it's okay to engage with them because it's not political campaign anymore.
Okay. Just one thing I do want to flag is that in Massachusetts, there are some pretty strict laws around gifts that you can give to people, elected officials, and that also includes public employees. And the rule of thumb is it's $50. So keep that in mind, right? Like you can't, and I'm going to drop in the chat just the Commission on Ethics rules around that. But so if you're thinking about, oh, we want to invite, we're going to give we're going to give a free subscription to the mayor of Cambridge to come to every one of our shows. Do keep in mind the $50 gift. Maureen has a question that she would like to ask.
Hi, I'm Maureen Hennessy from the Clark out in the Berkshires. No snow today. It's very exciting. But I would just a follow up to what Luke was saying, because you said if they're an incumbent, but not if they're running. But unfortunately, given our current, they're always running. I mean, we're already hearing that, Senator Markey's already announced that he's running. So I'm just trying to figure out, because we're also hearing from organizations like Mass Creative and American Association of Museums, invite everybody to everything so that they can come. I mean, is that still okay, even if it just feels like it's always an election year, kind of. So,
Yeah, and again, the difficult part is it's really easy when you have an elected official that has a finite term limit, you know? Like it's like, oh, this person can't run again because they're no longer eligible, so it's over. And the all we have to go on is what the law says, and the law says if it's a political campaign, now you're in, political campaign activity territory. If they're an elected official and they're already in office and your engagement with them does not at all relate to a campaign, then yeah, you can engage with them. It's no longer kind of this danger area. But yeah, the difficulty is, with candidates, easier for our senators because their terms are longer, difficult for, our House and lower house lower chamber elected officials that are more frequent because they're always running. It is difficult. And it's like that there's no real clear guidance on it. It is just like be careful with it. And yeah, and if you're going to invite people and you want people to participate and engage, and they're always in an election year, make the offer available, invite everyone. Don't avoid as all these things, avoid the appearance of impropriety as we like to use in the legal ethics discipline.
And Maureen, that was just the only point I was going to add. It would be to invite all the candidates. Don't selectively invite one, then you could run into trouble. But if you know that there are other people already running for that office, extend the invitation to all of the candidates, and then you should be okay.
Here's another really great question. Can a member of a nonprofit's leadership staff, or I would say staff in general, participate in activities on behalf of a candidate if that work is done completely outside of their workday and separate from their work?
I guess I don't know what you mean by like participate in activities. You mean like they're doing regular stuff? Like, do you mean
So could
other
you,
than campaign activity?
so you're really passionate about a candidate and you decide you want to like knock on doors and like, say like, door knocking
Oh,
or make
oh,
phone calls
okay.
in support of a candidate. Or you are even more excited about them and you decide you want to volunteer on the campaign to like help them shape a cultural policy plan.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. When I read it as like the campaign staff. And it's like, wait, no, if you're a staff for a nonprofit, you can engage in all of this activity in your own independent capacity. Again, the concern is, avoid the appearance of impropriety. Like if you are personally, like we all have personal opinions, we all have personal feelings about candidates for public office and legislation and stuff like that. You are welcome to have and express and volunteer and, engage with the candidates that you feel strongly about on a personal level. It's just you have to, yes, be very clear that you're doing it on your own time, independent of your professional capacity at the nonprofit organization. And, I think of things like social media, like, make sure that if you're, posting on your own Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or whatever that is, yours, but it's very clear from that you are still staff with this organization. Make clear that it's like, this is a reflecting of my personal opinion. It is not reflective of the nonprofit that I work with. Even something like opinions are my own is usually a good catch-all.
That's really helpful, right? Right. So again, reinforcing the idea that like the First Amendment exists. We're all individual citizens. We are all allowed to have our own opinions. Thank you so much. We have literally 1 minute, and I just want to also flag this, right? Earlier this week, we saw that the administration has instructed the IRS to review Harvard University's charitable tax status. So we're living in a moment where IRS tax statuses are being politicized. What should we know as 501c3s related to what is the actual law versus what a directive about investigating an organization's tax status is? Go, you two.
So, first of all, the executive branch cannot just order the IRS to go and investigate whoever they want. The law that's not permissible under the law. The thing is, like, we're dealing with a time where right now our that this really depends on whether the executive and whether our, elected officials want to follow the law, and that's kind of where we're at right now, is that they're kind of putting their line in the sand and saying, we're going to keep pushing the limit and not testing the law. The law says that here are the very clear criteria for whether you are a charitable exempt nonprofit, and you either are or you aren't because you're eligible and the activities you do are right. None of us get to decide whether you're exempt or not, or whether you're charitable or not. It's the facts of what you're doing. You are either exempt or you're not. You're either charitable or you're not. So can a elected official, can the president order the IRS, which is the Department of the Treasury, which is within the executive branch, can they order them to do that and to investigate charitable nonprofits that they dislike? No, no, that's not legal. Can they try it anyway and throw things at the wall and see what happens? Yeah. It's like when people ask, can they sue me for this? Yeah, anyone can sue. Anyone can stir up trouble for any reason whatsoever. Whether they can legally do so and succeed is a different matter.
That's
And
helpful.
that's where we're at right now. Uh,
Thank you. Thank you, Luke. All right. Any final thoughts, words of wisdom, Jessica, Luke, before we sign off for today?
I would just encourage everybody to advocate, to educate, and to the extent you don't cross the thresholds, to lobby as well, because you are permitted to engage in certain activities so long it is not substantial and so long as you don't cross the Massachusetts state threshold for requiring registration. So don't be afraid of it. Don't shy away. Our elected officials are people. I know I sometimes still feel intimidated when I speak to them, but it's important to speak up on behalf of the causes that you work for and that you believe in. And happy to talk offline as well if you have further questions. So thank you for engaging and being here today, being interested.
Thank you all for being on this call with us, Jessica and Luke. Thank you for your insight, your skills, your knowledge, and thank you for reminding us and encouraging us to get in the game, right? This is what we got to do every day, all the, I should say every day, all the time, to an insubstantial amount.
yeah. And never forget, these elected officials, they work for you. They work for me. They work for all of us. We're their employers, right? So don't be afraid of that. Don't be intimidated by them, because remember, you're their boss.
Thank you all. Have a great day. Jessica and Luke, thank you. And thanks to Mass Nonprofit Network and Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts and Arts and Business Council. Having partners like you make this such a lighter lift. Have great weekends, and we will see you soon.